An old Sioux chief named Horned Horse told the late Captain William Philo Clark that, too feeble to fight the conventional way, he ascended a hill overlooking the battlefield to grieve his son's death early in the war. From his vantage point, he could see almost everything that transpired from the start. The Little Bighorn is a creek that plunges precipitously into the northern cliffs close to the location of Custer's death. It is tainted with dangerous quicksand. The Indians spotted the troops on the bluffs early that morning, but the steep and high riverbanks prevented Custer from reaching the edge of the stream. The valley of the Little Bighorn ranges from half a mile to a mile and a half wide, and for a stretch of nearly 50 miles it was lined with the vast Indian village. When the tribesmen noticed the troops on the heights, the majority of the massive pony herd was out for a graze. The warriors rushed to grab their weapons, but by the time they were armed and ready, the soldiers had vanished. The Indians initially believed they had driven off the soldiers due to the overwhelming strength of their village. However, after what felt like a long wait, the head of Custer's column reappeared, moving down a dry creek bed that formed a narrow ravine toward the river's edge. Custer made a bold attempt to cross, but he was met with a furious barrage from the savages' repeating rifles. His lead troops were driven back toward the bluffs, losing several men who fell into the shallow water, only 18 inches deep, and were swallowed by quicksand. This accounts for the disappearance of Lieutenant Harrington and several other men whose bodies were never found on the battlefield. They were neither taken prisoner by the Indians nor able to break through the fierce line of enraged warriors. Horned Horse didn't know Custer by sight but figured he was the officer who led the column that tried to cross the stream. Custer then attempted to move his men up the bluffs diagonally with everyone dismounted. They fired over the backs of their horses whenever they could as the Indians, now numbering in the thousands and mostly on foot, had crossed the river and attacked Custer from the flank and rear. Meanwhile, others kept up a relentless fire from across the river, further harassing the general and his men. Surrounded on all sides, the troops fought bravely, but the enemy's fire was so fierce and unrelenting that they fell like snowflakes before it, piling up dead among their horses. The exact duration of the fight was unclear, but it took a long while to kill all the soldiers. The firing continued without pause until the last man of Custer's command lay dead. Custer's body was among the few that had not yet been scaled. The warriors had become tired of the carnage. The stream where most of the soldiers perished flowed red with blood, though he had witnessed many massacres, none compared to this one. Had the troops not been burdened by their horses, which plunged, reared, and kicked under the relentless fire from the Sioux, they might have fared better. As it was, many Indians fell, with the soldiers' revolvers proving deadly at close range. Pistols killed more Indians than rifles did. The carbines were prone to failure, easily becoming leaded, and having their cartridge shells stick in the breech when heated due to a flaw in the ejector. It's likely that many of Custer's cavalrymen were effectively disarmed because of this unreliable weapon. Had they been armed with reliable Winchesters or another type of repeating firearm, the outcome of the Battle of the Little Bighorn might have been different. What became of Custer after he vanished down the north bank of the river has already been recounted by Curly and Horned Horse. None of the officers or men from the 5 troops under Custer survived to tell the tale. The male members of the Custer family, George A., Colonel Tom, and Boston, were all killed. Audie Reed, a young relative of the general who, like Boston, had joined the command as an observer, also met his end. Mark Kellogg of the St. Paul and Bismarck Press, the sole correspondent to accompany the Custer column, nearly managed to escape. Sadly, his mule was too slow and he was soon apprehended and put to death. Had he succeeded in escaping, his renown might have rivaled that of the explorer Stanley. Reno crossed the Little Bighorn with a few scouts and pressed down the valley for quite a distance. He eventually took cover in the timber and later claimed he was attacked by overwhelming numbers. After holding his position for only a short while, he decided it was best to retreat across the river and set up on the bluffs. This maneuver was clumsily carried out, and in the process of scaling the bluffs, several officers and men were killed or wounded. The Indians, as is often the case when white troops fall back before them, grew increasingly bold and managed to pull several soldiers from their saddles. Captain DeRudio, an Italian officer exiled from his homeland for political reasons, and a scout who couldn't keep pace with Reno's main force, hid themselves in the brush. DeRudio and the scout could have reached out and touched the Indians as they passed so near. They were lucky to remain undetected and rejoined Reno on the 27th, after Terry and Gibbon arrived. Colonel Frederick W. Benteen provided the following account of his battalion's movements after splitting from the main force. According to Custer's orders, there was to be no coordination between Reno, McDougal, and myself. I was sent several miles to the left of where Custer fell, tasked with scouting for more Indians. With my battalion of 3 troops, I set off to fulfill this mission, leaving the rest of the regiment, 9 troops, halted and dismounted. As I carried out Custer's initial orders, along with 2 additional ones relayed to me through the regiment's sergeant major and chief trumpeter at different times, it became clear that the Indians were too shrewd to travel the terrain I had been sent to explore unless driven to do so. I decided to veer right to follow the main column's trail, knowing that my battalion would have plenty to do with the other units. I managed to catch up just before McDougal and his pack train arrived. I watered my battalion's horses at the bog by the roadside, just as McDougal's pack train arrived. I left McDougal to handle his train as best he could and pressed on, feeling a hunch that hot work was ahead. As I continued on my path, I met 2 orderlies carrying messages, one intended for McDougal and the other for me. The messages, penned and signed by Lieutenant Cook, adjutant of the regiment, simply read, "Come on, be quick and bring packs." Seeing no Indians between the packs and the main column, I decided not to return for them, which was about 7 or 8 miles back, nor did I see the point in waiting where I'd received the orders. Instead, I pressed forward at a brisk trot and reached Reno's position just in time to help save his outfit. From there, it's a well-known story. Reno, Benteen, and McDougal united their forces and established a stronghold on the bluffs, successfully fending off the entire Indian force that besieged them until the 27th. The Indians made several fierce assaults on their position, all of which were bravely repelled. The troops, especially the wounded, suffered greatly from thirst. During the night, a few daring soldiers risked their lives to fetch water from the river using their camp kettles. Mr. Theodore Golden, who was serving with the 7th Cavalry, was one of these courageous men. The beleaguered troops, surrounded and in dire straits, saw a glimmer of hope when General Gibbon's infantry and light artillery column, with General Terry, came into view on the morning of the 27th. At this sight, Reno's men rushed out from their makeshift defenses, cheering the heroes of Fort Fisher and Petersburg with great enthusiasm. Many soldiers wept with relief, and both General Terry and General Gibbon did everything in their power to uplift the exhausted men during their time of hardship. The Indians, having spent a great deal of ammunition and wearied from their efforts, did not make any further attempts to attack after the relief force arrived. They withdrew toward the mountains, first burning whatever could not be moved from their village. Some of their teepees had already been destroyed during the clash with Custer. After a brief rest, General Gibbon set out to find out what had become of Custer's command. Reno's men feared the worst for their comrades, having seen the guidons of the 7th Cavalry being waved triumphantly by the savages during the afternoon of the 25th and the morning of the 26th. General Gibbon marched several miles before he reached the bloody field. The scene that greeted him was harrowing. The bluffs were strewn with the bodies of Custer's men, all stripped and mostly mutilated in the grisly fashion typical of such encounters. The general's body was discovered near the top of the bluff, surrounded by the corpses of his brothers and most of his officers. The Indians declined to disrespect his remains because they respected and honored his bravery and heroism. General Gibbon's 7th Infantry buried the fallen where they lay, marking the graves of those they could identify. Custer's remains, along with those of his relatives and many officers, were eventually recovered. The courageous general now rests at West Point, his alma mater, where his illustrious career and heroic end are honored with lasting renown. While General Custer's body was horribly mutilated, his brother Tom's was beyond recognition. Tom Custer's remains could only be identified by a tattoo. Out of the 206 other soldiers, several were left untouched by mutilation, and it appears that 2 soldiers were spared entirely, perhaps out of respect. General Custer himself had a leg slashed, an arrow forced into his manhood, and his ears pierced, possibly with arrows or awls.